territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people and my own presence on the traditional lands of the Fernandeño Tataviam people. As Professor Caswell has already noted, the Kenneth Karmiole Lecture in Archival Studies is an annual lecture in the UCLA Department of Information Studies. We are extremely grateful to the ongoing support of Ken Karmiole of this talk. We have always had really interesting state-of-the-art discussions that have come from these annual lectures. This year, they've covered a wide variety of topics, and this year we're actually covering a topic that we haven't talked about before, and one that I think is also very close to Ken Karmiole's own background himself, and that is one that is looking at American literary archives. And I'm delighted that we have with us tonight Dr. Amy Hildreth Chen, who I think is having a lot of, giving a lot of talks in a lot of different places. So we're very lucky to have her here. She has recently published a book that is really a groundbreaking book called Placing Papers, the American Literary Archives Market, which was published with the University of Massachusetts Press. This is a book that looks at the history and evolution and impact of American literary archives, addresses all of the different parties who are involved with those kinds of papers: authors, dealers, families, directors of special collections and curators, scholars, and the public, and really thinking about the demographics of those archives and, you know, what their future is. This is a time of huge challenges for special collections and for those who work with literary manuscripts in terms of the cost of acquiring these materials, in terms of treating the creators of these materials equitably, the space that they take up, competition between repositories, and new concerns about digital and digitized formats. And Dr. Chen, who has a PhD from Emory University in English and also a background as an academic librarian, is going to talk to us today a bit more about the work behind that book, but also extending that to look at the Black and Latinx experience in the literary archive market. And so I'm really pleased to have her here tonight. I want to turn it over now to Dr. Chen.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a delight to be here digitally. I wish I could be present in LA to speak with you all in person, but I truly am honored to have this opportunity to talk to you. So I'm now going to share my presentation with you. And I look forward to answering your questions as we go through and at the end. So again, I'm Amy Hildreth Chen. I am the author of Placing Papers, the American Literary Archives Market, which was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2020. I am here to speak on behalf of the 2022 Kenneth Karmiole Lecture in Archival Studies. I'm very honored and very flattered to be here today. And I'm going to be talking about the Black and Latinx experience on the literary archive market. You may note I am an independent scholar currently, so but don't hesitate to contact me or continue the conversation at any time. My Twitter handle is my full name, just at Amy Hildreth Chen. So that's a good way to get in touch with me, and I'm always excited to hear from anyone I really missed the opportunity to speak with students. I was looking forward to that. So to get started, I'm going to be covering 4 things. I'm going to give you an introduction of my research, both in my book and what I've done to diversify my own work, the methodology I follow, the results I found, both qualitative and quantitative, and a call to action. It's always a good way to end. When I used to teach in special collections, I used to say that a good class ended when students were angry. So I like to end with a little punch. So first off, to introduce what I came to this project with, I got my PhD at Emory and I worked in Emory Special Collections for many years. And there I was concerned because I wondered if there was a difference between how authors of color placed in the literary archives market versus white authors. And when I was there in person, I saw equal treatment, but it made me wonder if there were historical inequities. And of course, I suspected there were, because why not? However, I carried that into my research and I had to put it aside because what I did was a data-driven method. And what I saw in the data was that that's not necessarily the case. The difference is authors of color actually do place better or equal to white authors once the market determines them to be of interest. And that's the kicker, because white authors had purchased in the market much, much earlier. In my original data set, it was 25 years earlier. And then in this data set, it's a little bit less time. So the discrimination happens early, but once the market gets over that hurdle, things go fairly well. So that was an interesting conclusion that I found in placing papers that I wanted to delve into more for this talk and maybe a resulting publication. So my hypothesis when I went into my new data set for this talk was that authors of color place better than white authors on the market once they're determined to be of interest, right? But what I found, of course, was a little bit different than what I thought going in. What I found was that Black authors place better than white authors, but white authors do better than Latinx authors once the market determines them to be of interest. So there is a stratification based on what demographic group you're a part of. And that's a really interesting result, and it's not one that unifies all authors of color together. It separates by who you are. And I think that's something that's really worth talking about. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So first, how did I get to this conclusion? Well, I needed to expand my canon. I started off my research for my paper by looking at a general anthology, the Norton Anthology of American Literature. And I chose an anthology to populate my data set because I didn't want to cherry pick my own authors. I didn't want to say, I think this person is important, this person isn't. I wanted a group of top scholars in the field to make that determination for me. And if you read my book, I have kind of a long side note about the problems that come up with anthologies. They are notoriously racist and sexist, and they have a long and somewhat problematic history. However, there's still what I think is the best way to start if you want to look at what is the canon. And I was interested in who were the top people in the field of late 20th and 21st century literature and what happened to their papers. So I went with the canon available to me, which was the Norton. However, once I reopened my work to start again, I thought, okay, I need to diversify because authors of color are the minority, of course, within the Norton Anthology of American Literature, and that's problematic, right? There's just simply not enough population there to really get a good look at what's happening on the ground. So I went to the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature and Norton Anthology of African American Literature to gather up the names of the canons from the Latinx and Black communities. And that helped me get a more representative sample when I was able to focus just on each demographic group within their own peer set without having to be party to white authors. So the dates you'll see at the bottom of the screen are the dates when the anthology was published, and then the bottom is when that data set was locked. And so I'm going to talk about that next. But locked means that's when I finished collecting data and I closed it to any additional information coming in. Okay, so to set up my methodology on how I found my conclusions, as I mentioned, I chose an anthology. Then I did something really basic. I made a spreadsheet. And I'm telling you this because I really want more people to work in this field. And if I share my methodology, maybe you can skate over the few years it took me to figure out the basics. Make a spreadsheet. Put every single name in the anthology within your selected group or time period on the left. Put all your variables up on the top. Okay, so each column is a variable. Okay, and then all you do is you search for the literary archives. Okay, and so the way that I did this is I went to Google, I typed the person's name and either archives, or I would do the person's name and papers. So those were the two synonyms that I tried. And I would find the largest collection under their name. If I couldn't find anything through the basic Google search, I went to Archive Grid and I just typed their name. I didn't do archives or papers appended to that. So at that point, the largest collection that I found, and I'll talk about size as a proximity for whether or not this is the primary set of papers a little bit later. But at that point, I recorded the URL and then I went through the finding aid and I noted the data for every variable point that I had decided that was important. So the problem is of course, finding aids really differ in the amount of information they provide. So at this point, if there was data that was missing from the finding aid, I would contact the organizations to get the extra information. That takes quite a long time. So then once all of that process is completed, I locked the data, which meant I didn't change it after this point. And that's really important because, as most of you know, the difference between when you research something and when you write it, and then when you publish it, those can be many years, in fact, especially if you're writing a book rather than an article, but there's a lot of time that intervenes. And so something you say is true at one point can change if you're working with relatively contemporary figures. So for example, I unfortunately had several people in my data set die, and then their papers got placed. And so it was really important to say, look, my data stopped at this point in time. And anything that happened after that is irrelevant because I had to, at some point, it's just unrealistic for me to kind of keep updating and then redoing all of my numbers. Okay, so you have to lock your data. Once I locked my data, I analyzed it. Funny side note, I was really proud of myself and thought I was doing statistics. And one of the peer reviewers I had looking at my work was like, Amy, no, you're not doing statistics, you are counting. So way to put me in my place, right? But counting is surprisingly powerful. Something so simple is so powerful. So that's something I did just to see what the patterns were. And then I found patterns and I found outliers. So those were the two things I was looking for. What's the most kind of common result? And what are the results that really stand out as strange in one way or another? And then I would determine its significance, both quantitatively through the data and then qualitatively, because once I had those patterns or those standout examples, I started digging into that and I did more traditional humanities-based research to understand what was happening at that moment. And that's where you get a lot of the fun stories that you see in my book. So I won't spoil them for you, but if you haven't read it, please do. There's a lot of juicy stuff when you're researching literary archives or any kind of archives. You do get a lot of gossip, and so it's kind of like a rollicking good time as a researcher. Once I have my qualitative and quantitative results and significance, I summarized it. So that's the methodology. So what I'm going to present to you today is slightly more intermediary. I haven't contacted organizations and technically I have not locked my data. So what I'm presenting is the information that I could find through publicly available finding aids. So I haven't done that extra work to fill in the data set completely. And so therefore, when I'm showing you my results, you'll see some kind of like not found notation so that you know that there's caveats on these numbers. However, I do think that my findings are likely to stand, but I want to be transparent about where I am in the process. Okay, so what are the variables that matter? The ones I'm going to talk about are placement, institution, stakeholder, circumstances, size, age, and market. So let's start with placement. Why does placement matter? Placement matters for 4 reasons, probably more, but we'll stick with 4 for today. Representation. If you don't have a diverse literary archive, you do not have an understanding of the literary history. You will come away, students and scholars of the future or of today, thinking about the past, will come away thinking that certain moments in time really had standout voices that looked a certain way, but not another. And that leads to significant bias in the historical record and a misunderstanding of the artistic moments that have brought forward so much richness today. We also want to think about, since I'm interested in American literary archives as a whole, we want a representation of the American body politic too. So I will be talking a little bit about how we need to think more broadly about representation, not just based on who are the top writers, but also what does our country look like and how we can reflect that in the works that we collect. Second, placement matters because of preservation. If it's not in an archive, it's liable to be lost. And that's just sort of a fact of life. And it won't stop. So we need to make sure that we have something that's, under climate control, that's been designated to be of value to the future. Things get lost in climate damage. They get lost because of bit rot. If it's a born digital file, there's whole bunches of reasons. Different things get transferred and then lost because people just simply can't find them in their homes. So having it in a repository is a commitment to preservation. 3, scholarship. If we want the literary art, or if we want the literary history of the future to be written correctly, to reflect all the different voices that were interacting and bouncing off each other and feeding into one another, we need that to be in the archive. If it's not saved, if it's not preserved, and if it's not well represented, scholarship itself will be innovated. And then lastly, education. We want students to see arts and culture for what it is, for its challenges, for the ways in which it makes us question our moment, and helps us reflect and shape our lives in different ways. It expands our horizons. And so we need to be able to foster student inquiry, just like we want to foster our scholars' inquiry. And by doing that, we have to have the papers in the archive. So let's start at the beginning, placement. Who got placed in archive? I have 3 demographics. Oh, and I should say too, my white demographic, what I did is I took the Norton Anthology of American Literature and I removed all authors of color for obvious reasons. You're not going to have a white anthology. That would be extremely problematic, right? I mean, of course, there were tons of white anthologies not very long ago, but in order to get this result, I wanted to compare demographic groups to see if there was any sort of bias going on or anything else that could be problematic. So I stripped out authors of color and therefore collected their names in the designated Black and Latinx anthologies. So white means you are a white author and you are in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, the Latino literature anthology, and then the African American literature anthology. So each of these anthologies, if you look at the denominator, the African American anthology had 75 people listed within the time period that I was interested in, which is you had to be born post 1900. The Latinx collection had 136 authors, and the Norton Anthology collected 66 people. And I'm sure you're going to the fact that the white placement was the highest, 84.6%. Then the Black placement at 77.3%. So a little bit worse, but not too bad, actually quite close. And then, which is going to be the theme of tonight, the Latinx papers, which were only 44.9%. So not even 50% of the papers have come into institutional hands. So why do institutions matter? Institutions matter because of prestige, funding, and access. They're prestigious because they have high funding. So these two, really all three, they're intertwined, right? The way you measure prestige, if you are an ARL, which is an association of research libraries, in the ARL investment index, is by funding levels. So the higher your rank, the more money you have. The more money you have, the more likely you are to be able to provide good access to your holdings by holding exhibitions, talks, by having better staffed and better supported reading rooms. It may also mean that you have the ability to be more proactive in your acquisitions, to go after the papers that you think are really important and valuable and marry well with the other people in your holdings, rather than be reactive and only taking donations or those papers that you are able to afford within a certain limit. So these three are intertwined, but they're also intertwined for another reason, because really top authors bring cachet to an institution, right? If you have a really important person, that makes your institution look really, really good and valuable and top notch. The other way around, if you're an author, being sought by a top institution makes you seem even better. You might have a ton of literary awards, but that kind of puts a cap on your head. So this is a symbiotic relationship. If you look at where different authors placed according to institutions, you're going to notice quickly that there is a relatively few number of institutions that all kind of live together at the top of the rankings. So if you are African American, the institutions that are most likely to collect you are Emory and the New York Public Library, followed by Harvard, Yale, and Boston. And then there's a few at the Library of Congress, that's what LSE stands for, Spelman and Berkeley. And then I have plus 20 other institutions that just have one set of papers. So going with that, the Latinx and white collections, though, are a little bit more similar. They're both sitting with their most frequently collected institutions as UT Austin and Stanford as being the top, with the white collections being a little bit more prevalent at Harvard and the Latinx collections being supported by UC Santa Barbara. So you're seeing UT Austin, Stanford, and Harvard with Yale come around as the most active institutions in the market, and surprise, surprise, those are also highly funded. So here you can just think, all right, UT Austin has 20 of the papers collected in the market that I tracked. Stanford has 13, and this is an aggregate across all demographic groups, with Emory, Harvard, the New York Public Library, and Yale each at third place. So that still shows you even then that there's a significant difference between Stanford and UT Austin and their ability to participate in the market. And it was really interesting, actually, because when I did my research for placing papers, Stanford was important and I dedicated part of a chapter to them. However, they weren't this active. So Stanford really did a good job of seeking out the papers of Latinx authors. So I want to commend them for that. And since I'm speaking to you at UCLA, the only UCLA collection that made it into the data set was of Chester B. Himes. And I was proud to see that one of my former professors, Lawrence P. Jackson, recently wrote a biography of Chester Himes. And so that's the collection that you guys have that made it into my data set. My third results, stakeholders. Why do stakeholders matter? So Anne, Professor Anne, she mentioned this in my introduction, that one of the things I did in my book was think really carefully about the differences between perspectives, whether you're an author or a family member or a literary agent, a rare book and manuscript dealer, public, or a scholar, and each one of those groups has a push and pull. There's the demand side of the market, which is the scholars, the students, the public, but the institutions too. Those are the people that want to acquire the papers, and the supply side is the authors and the families, and then also sometimes the agents and dealers. So there's the supply and demand side, and they're always interacting to create the market as we see it. So who is involved in placing the papers and literally transferring the papers from private to, I guess, public? It could be a private institution, but private to public hands. Who that person was matters, because if they are the ones that, if anyone's getting paid, they're the ones getting paid. They're also the ones that are able to set restrictions. And sometimes authors set or stakeholders set very difficult restrictions, which might push out future scholarship and student work decades into the future, or really reshape the narratives that can come out of those papers. Restrictions have the ability to write the narrative before scholars even get in the door. So it's important to know who had the opportunity to shape that conversation. Stakeholders also matter because of timing. They might be a little slower on the uptake to get the papers into institutional hands, or they might be fast. It depends. So when those papers become available can sometimes be based on who is representing them. And then finally, kingmakers. Some stakeholders simply have a larger effect on the market. They're the ones who tend to get not only their authors paid, but paid a lot. They're the ones that get articles in the New York Times. So those are the people that are really the movers and shakers of the market. So if you see that stakeholder pop up in a finding aid, that tells you something. So when I did my updated research, these are the stakeholders that I found by type, dealing with each type of paper. Okay, so overall, kind of no matter who you are, you're most likely to represent yourself, right? Okay, there's a substantial difference between white authors and Black authors in terms of how often they represent themselves, but you can kind of see a nice stair step. So nothing too untoward there. Families, white authors are more likely to have their families represent them at a pretty different interval than, say, Black and Latinx authors. But what I think is very important when you're looking at this is where I have the arrows, which is that Latinx authors are not represented by rare book and manuscript dealers, at least not the ones that were on the data set that I was able to create. And they're not represented by literary agents. And that is really important because those are the people that get you the money, right? So I have two images here, Glenn Horowitz and Andrew Wiley. These are the people that I talked about in my book. Also Ken Lopez, who's not pictured. So those are the three folks that I pulled out as kind of kingmakers in this particular space. And if they're not working with you, that says something. And I wish I could have seen a different result. And of course, there's many other booksellers, there's many other literary agents that could be operating in the literary archives market, but I just didn't see it, at least in this group of writers. And that is where we're going to see a difference later too. So keep that in mind. Maybe there's a difference in terms of authors representing themselves. Maybe there's a difference with families or other circumstances, but what we're really seeing is a difference in professional representation for Latinx authors. Okay, next one. Why do circumstances matter? Circumstances, I guess, is my code for, did it get bought or was it given? Was it sold or was it donated? Circumstances matter due to potential bias. Are you less likely to get paid if you're a Latinx author? Are you more likely to get paid if you're a white author? These things matter, right? They matter for the authors. They also matter for the families who are, being supported by the authors and for the future of their reputation. However, you can't be too quick to judge because you have to think also about the overall economy. We are dealing with institutions that have their own issues. They are, they're having to deal with the ups and downs of the oil market or however else their endowments are adjudicated. So it's important not to just look at the curators as potentially being biased, but to also think, well, what circumstances were they given to make collection decisions? Okay, so we have to kind of look at one level and then back it up a little bit more to be fair. So what I found when I looked at how papers are placed is there is a difference between donation and sale. And then not listed, like I mentioned, is the places where that information wasn't available on the finding aid. And that's important, again, because this is a pretty sizable amount of finding aids that did not list this really essential information. And that's because we're very socialized to not talk about money, right? And so that's something that often doesn't get included, and I really think should. However, the information I'm working with often did not include that information. But what I did find was rather egregious, which was there's a major difference between donations and sales for Latinx authors in particular. Black writers and white writers are doing quite well. White writers, of course, have the most sales, but Black writers are doing pretty well. But Latinx authors are not getting paid. And that is the difference that is coming out of, I would argue, partially the lack of representation by rare book and manuscript dealers, as well as literary agents. Again, the folks that are really able to get collections into top hands. So that's what I'm seeing right now. I'll leave it there, but for me, that was pretty striking. And to spend a little bit more time on this point, the following authors are the ones who did sell their papers and where they went. So the places that did pay included UT Austin, Columbia, Emory, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford. And so these names include, some of the top voices of the field. You might not be surprised. So thankfully, they were able to get compensation for their work, but not everyone was or can. And then I like this nice little Google image of Gloria and Anzaldúa kind of representing on the search engine. So my next results are, why does collection size matter? Collection size matters because space is a resource. Space is something that has to be heated. It has to be cooled for temperature control. You have to buy the shelves. It's in perpetuity. So if you grow out of the space that you're in currently, you have to pay for an offsite storage location. Then you have to pay for collections to be kind of bussed between the offsite storage location and where visitors are able to sit in the reading room. So it's something that is constantly an issue. If you've ever worked in special collections, there's always a push and pull between what you want and what kind of space you can allocate. Collection size also matters because sometimes a larger collection has a greater amount of variety in it. So you might get a richer set of holdings. So there's a big difference between a collection that has, say, the manuscript for one author's or for one novel versus an archive that includes correspondence, materials from some of the organizations he or she volunteered with, brochures from events and lectures given. So the larger a collection is, the more likely it is to have a variety of materials that can be of interest to a lot of different groups coming to special collections and archives. Size is also an easy way to determine, is this the primary literary archive? Often really small collections mean maybe there's more stuff out there, and this is just kind of the beginning of the work that's coming into institutional hands, or maybe this is just correspondence with some other person, but it's not really based on the author of interest themselves. So those are the reasons why collection size matters. So here we see another really interesting result. Collection size in linear feet, and again on the right you'll see I didn't get that for everyone, but you're seeing a massive differential with white authors hitting 1,000 linear feet for their maximum size collections. And then when you boil it down to an average, it doesn't look quite so horrible, but still white authors are taking up way more space, literally way more space. But the problem, or maybe the interesting point here, is that is the result of one author Allen Ginsberg, who is sitting at Stanford University. And so the white average is 87.5 linear feet when you have Ginsberg in the data set, okay? And so there's a difference there. But when you take out Ginsberg as the one, because I remember I mentioned earlier that when I do quantitative data, I'm looking, when I moved into the qualitative work, I look for patterns or I look for outliers. And this is a case of when an outlier matters, right? The previous finding of that there was no literary agents or rare book dealers representing Latinx authors, that's a pattern. This is an outlier, okay? So you take out Ginsberg and boom, white linear footage drops to an average of 69.7 feet. And then you actually see that Black papers or papers from Black authors, boom, come up a little bit higher in terms of their maximum size and are nearly at parity with white collections or collections of white authors. And again, you see the unfortunate differential where you have Latinx collections being much smaller. So that doesn't go away. But you take out Ginsberg and all of a sudden the picture looks really, really different, which is why when you're doing that quantitative work, you can't just see a pattern and move on. You have to think, why is that? And the skew is Allen Ginsberg's papers are 1,000 linear feet, and that changes the whole story. So here, just a side note, you always got to pay attention to the skew. 6, why does age matter? Age matters because, again, are you getting paid early? Are you getting paid later in your life? Are you getting paid at all? Is there some sort of age discrimination going on, which could be in either direction? There could be a real fetish for sort of like the up and coming young author that's just hitting their stride, the kind of like, you know, under 30 type powerhouse. But then there can also be age discrimination in the fact that perhaps institutions really only want to look at authors who are distinguished, who've hit a certain level in their career, who have won X number of literary prizes or Y literary prize in particular, or have been included in anthologies, whatever the case may be. So that career development or age arc could go in either direction. It's not necessarily that younger is always better, older is always better, but what's going on here? And that also goes down to the marketability too, because you don't want to be so quick to judge like, oh, well, this is a curatorial bias. Again, it might just be, unfortunately, you just happen to be in the age bracket where the economy tanked and they can't pick you up until another 10 years later, right? The economy goes down and everyone suffers. And so that's something we have to take in mind too. And that is a point that could use a lot more unpacking than I'll have time for in this talk, but you have to think more broadly about what's going on than just this particular market. So talking about age also gets complicated because, of course, you can die, right? So there's a difference between the age of acquisition, meaning you were alive, or how many years post-mortem. I'm not sure the best way to say that. I always want to say postpartum, post-mortem. How many years it took after you died to be placed if you happen to die before your papers were transferred to an institution. So I broke it into two. We're going to look at first the people who are alive and then the people who died before acquisition. So when you look at those who are alive, you'll see a maximum going about mid-80s to early 90s, so quite elderly. You see a minimum ranging from, that's 31, so that's a lot younger than even I am, for a white author, all the way up to Black authors being placed kind of at the oldest range. So their papers aren't coming in until their early 40s at the start. And then on average, though, everyone looks kind of the same. There's sort of a good stair step between your mid 50s to your mid 60s when most people are getting acquired, right? So there's not a discrimination. There's not really a strong story here. And I think that's something else important to think about when you're looking at qualitative and quantitative data, is that not every variable is a gotcha story, or, you know, some are going to be more important than others. And I think that was the case here. So here you do see some skew, which is interesting. So this is years of acquisition after people have died. The minimum is always 1 year. And then the maximum varies from about 15 years all the way up to 50 years, with white authors taking the longest to get placed and Black authors doing the least. So here you can see again that the story of the African-American literary archive market is a positive one. Once you get past the initial discrimination at the start of the market, they do very well. But again, we see some kind of in the middle with the Latinx authors. So what's important here too is there's another kind of pickle when you're dealing with age, is that sometimes you can die the same year that your collection was acquired, and it's unclear from the information provided by the repository if you died first and then your papers got acquired, or your papers were acquired and you happen to die right after. I know this seems kind of macabre to talk about, but I have to think about it. So I included everyone who had a year of acquisition as 0. So people that were in that 1 year, they were placed at the same time that they died. I counted them all as living, just to be generous. So that's another reason to think about this variable being complex. But the story isn't quite so bad, just seeing here that Black authors do get placed faster than white or Latinx authors. Looking at the skew, the oldest and youngest in the data set are both white writers. One is Flannery O'Connor. She took 50 years to come to Emory. And if you're interested in that story, it's in my book. And the youngest was Thomas Pynchon, who managed to scoot in the door at UT Austin at the ripe old age of 31. So in that case, both extremes were from people that were white. All right, so we're closing in on the end. I hope you're getting excited for questions. So the 7th result was the market history. So thinking about the year the collection was placed. Market history matters because, like I've been kind of saying, ability may be more important than bias. What's going on in the world may control and does control what curators are able to do on the ground. It's not just what curators want, it's also what resources they're provided. And also intellectual trends change over time. Intellectual trends are different than the greater market, are different than just the literary collection market. So here we're putting many complicated things together just to get a snapshot. So I do want you to take that in mind, but it's important just to see sort of like what's the overall trends in terms of what years things are being picked up. So what you can see here is another quite interesting result, which is that white collections and authors are picked up by the market kind of starting in the 1950s. So that's when you get that long sort of setup. But then you have to wait until 1964. So this is earlier in this data set than the data set I used for my book. So you wait about 10 years until you get to the first African-American collection coming into institutional hands, and then a little bit longer to Latinx collections. So again, that kind of shows the demographics in terms of how, I guess, privilege is doled out in the literary collections market. First to white authors, then Black authors, then to Latinx authors. Okay, but the story doesn't have to be quite so bad if you're invested in diversity, which is all of a sudden you get this kind of drop, right, where institutions are really realizing that they have to diversify their repository, and they do so really starting in the 90s. And then all of a sudden you get a big downward shift where the Latinx and Black papers are going up. They're more likely to be picked up. However, that's less the case with white authors. So it's interesting, right? They're making an effort to diversify, but then that also has a result in other ways as well. So at this point, I've walked you through a whole lot of data. I've told you some stories. I wanted to kind of come back and think, well, what does this all mean? And of course, maybe we can talk about that in the chat. But what it means, for me at least, is that repositories and curators need to do a better job of paying for the collections of Latinx authors when they're able. They are doing well at getting Latinx collections in the door, seeking them out. They definitely could do more. One of the things that I noticed, and we'll talk about more in maybe a future publication, is that one of the problems with this data set is that the Latinx anthology included many, many more names than the African American or general anthology, which means that that does skew the statistics slightly, right? Because the percentages, there's a much larger denominator. So if you actually take that into consideration when you're combing through the data more than I could represent here, you could see that the literary archive market for Latinx collections is steadily increasing. There is an effort underway. However, those papers are less likely to be paid. They're more likely to be donations. And so I would really like to see a better and more consistent payment for those with this background. And it would be lovely if we could get more literary agents and rare book and manuscript dealers, people who really focus on their trade, to help out and to raise the overall profile, because they're the ones able to get a lot of interest and a lot of funding for those that they represent. Secondly, it's important to, if you're interested in following up on my research, and I really hope you are, that you look at literary archive placement rates for lesser known authors. A huge problem, I would say, with my own work is that because I'm concentrating on anthologies, I'm really focusing on writers who have made it, right? They're the ones that a whole bunch of literary scholars said, yes, I want to teach this in my Lit 101 class to my room of 300 students, right? These are the few, the proud, okay? But there's a lot more authors who make up the dynamism of American arts and letters, right? And so, and even though the canon does shift over time, it doesn't shift tremendously. But for every one author that's in the canon, there's 5, 6, 10, 20 more that have written astounding work, but just didn't make it through that narrow threshold, which also includes things like, do you have a piece that is readily able to put in an anthology, right? So I'm only looking at a very small sector of people. And if you look at a wider set of people, you might get a different perspective than I do. And I think all of this would give a richer sense of what's really happening in the market. And I can only do one slice. So I hope to invite you to diversify my work, not just by focusing on authors of different backgrounds, but also thinking about different source sets you could create for your own data. So with that, I want to leave time for questions. Thank you very much. And it was such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Amy. I think you can see the questions that have been coming up in the chat, and maybe you'd like to respond to those.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to scroll up. All right. So the first question was, who bears the cost for organizing a person's archives before it is transferred to an institution? So that person does. That's the kind of the short answer, unless they have some sort of other funding that they were able to acquire for themselves to support maybe the cost of like a community archive or something, or if they're able to get grant money. I haven't looked into that, but just kind of based on my own living knowledge working in the field for about a decade, it's the person, which again means that there's a differential, right, in the circumstances of the person. One of the things is important to note is that some writers who might have really high profiles now died with very little money, and so often in poverty. And so not everyone's archive is going to look as good because they maybe didn't have the support on the ground to preserve their papers before they even got to the archive. So that loss starts early. It doesn't just start when things don't get in the door. So 2, is there any research being conducted about the sale of Caribbean authors' papers? Not that I know of. Please, can you do it? I am only one person and I have very limited knowledge. So that's a great question, but I don't have an answer. 3, has any of your research gone deeper to see consumers of authors by race? Oh, that's interesting, like readership studies. Do Latinx consumers typically support Latinx authors while a majority of Black authors consumers are also Black? I don't know. That's a whole different sector of scholarship, kind of readership studies. And I know there's a lot of interesting work out there, but I'm not particularly acquainted with it. It does make me think of the kind of pushback against bookstores kind of placing people by ethnicity, sort of like ethnic sections. You know, I've heard this even goes into like supermarkets, right? Like why can't we just put literature in literature section instead of sticking everyone according to their skin tone? So I don't know, but I would suggest you search readership studies to see who these readers are, and also if that's reflected in the kind of demographic that's doing research too, because of course the public is different than the scholarly public. Okay, 4. Oh, this is great, thank you. I have 2 separate questions. Do you have any plans to expand your studies to include other non-white author collections, Asian, to make a larger comparison? Yes, I would like to, but I don't have a good anthology that I was able to do for this particular work. But yes, I have certainly thought about Asian collections, but I haven't gotten there yet. But it would be very interesting to see, because the results between Black and Latinx authors were so different. Those are really different narratives. It would be interesting to put a third party in the mix to see what we tease out. Next question, should a library or archive contact, or who should they contact to find out about appraisal if they wanted to buy papers other than ask for a donation, assuming the author is still alive? I mean, I would say the author themselves, or if they have a literary agent or other representative that kind of focuses on their kind of copyright and other intellectual matters, to do that as well. I'm not as well versed on the legal side of how that would go, but in my experience, it often is a direct conversation, and probably series of conversations. Often it's a lifelong relationship or something that's groomed over decades to really attract the top people to the repository. 5, what advice would you have for choosing a canon for cooks and chefs? Oh, cool. I'm doing a similar research for my curatorial specialty, but there isn't a Norton equivalent. Yeah, but you're pondering. Okay, well, that's really interesting. You know, I mean, just to shoot off the top of my head, I would say something like is there like a New York Times or some other index of the most popular cookbooks at a certain time period? So say, like, if you're interested in the 90s, you know, what was 1991, 92, 93, 94, 95, what was their top 10 cookbooks each year, you know? And so I do a lot more work with kind of popular press, usually like New York Times and related periodicals, to often do that kind of adjudication for me. So maybe that would be a way, just like by like sales. Again, I tend to find like just go to the money, and that'll tell you a lot. So I guess that's what I would do, but I'm sure you could come up with something cool too. Does your data show any correlation of collecting with how different academic areas and their priorities are developing on campus? Oh yes, for the scholarly needs of Chicanx or Latinx studies that traditionally do not have large collections to draw on for campus. Okay, that is a really good point. I have not worked with that yet. I think that there is a lot to say, because of course, my understanding is that kind of Black and African-American centers really had kind of an early foothold on American campuses, and then that got spread out to kind of Asian Pacific Islander and Latinx and different other groups that needed to be represented. And so as we sort of see more support for that type of presence, maybe that would also parallel to the collections. I wonder which comes first, kind of chicken or egg, right? That is something that is worth digging into, but I have not done it. Am I aware of electronic literary archives? Today, writers rarely write letters, but email. Yes, yes. And create literary personas. Yes. I don't know much about that. I stop with paper archives. I do talk about born digital work a bit in my book, and that's something that I am interested in because, of course, most of us live entirely on computers nowadays. But the problem with electronic literary archives is that there's not really much out there in terms of how that is delivered to the user. it gets complicated. Like, do you emulate environments, or like, do you just get like PDFs of every text message, you know, Salman Rushdie sent? You know, it gets complicated because, of course, the paratextual relationship between the content of a media and what's around it, it's more complex, right? And so I think that literary archives are going to have to be digital, but how that is preserved is more complicated and expensive due to the type of expertise it requires, and it requires more resources to deliver to an end user. And then the way it's delivered is often really poor in terms of its richness to compare to the original environment in which it was created. It's not linear, right? Papers can be linear, but electronic material cannot. Okay, and then as a curator, I have often bumped up against wealthy donors wanting to collect their favorites. Yep, the same ethnic background, let's face it, usually white, yep. And resisting diverse collecting, yeah, because we all have this idea that we get in our heads from school, which is why we need to diversify, because we just think of like, oh, T.S. Eliot, you know, at least that's kind of how I was trained. And I suspect this has impacted your data set repayment of authors. Yes, we often have to rely on donations or lesser sources of funding to purchase diverse collections. Do you have any advice to counter this? You know, I think education, I think one thing that we can say about the current movements that are kind of rocking our country right now is I think it has really blown up this notion that that you can look away from what's happening. And I think you can turn and you could say, look, the hottest things going on right now, and that's a poor choice of words, I could say, but you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, all the labor movements, the ways in which Asian Americans are beginning to speak out against the racial violence they've incurred. So I think that this is part and parlance of what we are learning to really engage with. And I'm speaking for myself as a white person, that you can point to your donors and say, look, this is what is important and what is going on right now. And do you want to be part of and contribute to preserving the people that are really at the center of the storm, that are the ones that are really, you know, like Amanda Gorman at the inauguration. I think the way to do it is to both educate them that the past was always more diverse than many of us were taught in school. And secondly, the best way to be relevant is to work with the people that are really hip right now and the ones that are really making waves right now. Okay, so that's the final question. I'm going to give it back. It was so lovely to answer everything you had to say. Really good work. Please go forward. I'm excited to see what you all do next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hildreth Chen. That was wonderful. And I particularly appreciate the time you took to sort of delineate the research design that you were using, because I think what it underscores for all of us is that research in practice is really, really important, and it's doable. It's not necessarily easy, but it's definitely doable. And you're able to see things that, you know, our own assumptions and hunches just can't actually reveal to us in the same way. And I love these questions because they raise so many more questions as well and areas to study. So thank you so much. This was really wonderful. And thank you to everybody else who came tonight and contributed. And I hope, Amy, that you'll consider coming back to UCLA for a little longer, where we can have more discussion of some of these topics in more detail. We really miss having you in person here tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. It was a delight and an honor. All right, well, have a good evening, everyone.